All right. So, time to have a look at some of those key sociologists that were mentioned back in chapter 1 that we haven't gotten to yet. Because now's the time when some of them start to make a little bit of sense. Because sociology really gets its start with the Industrial Revolution. And so, one of the key questions being asked in the 19th century was, well, what is going on? What is this industrial revolution? They didn't necessarily even call it that, but they could see something fundamental is changing in society. So what's going on? That's the first question. And a key person in answering that was a German economist, philosopher, sociologist named Karl Marx. Now, often when we hear the name Karl Marx now, we think, well, Marxism, Cold War, Soviet Union, it's all discredited and gone. Why do we care about Karl Marx when he was proven so wrong? Well, except only kind of part of the ideas. The ideas called Marxism, which are not really Marx himself, but political theories kind of built on his ideas, on his analysis. And indeed, Marx himself, later in his life, famously said that I am not a Marxist. Which I'm sure when some of you read that back in chapter 1, scratched your heads and said, well, wait a minute, how can Karl Marx not be a Marxist? Isn't he the guy that started it all? Well, we'll get back to that. But first, we need to look at his analysis, because that is still pretty much on target. And indeed, Marx came up with a couple of key ideas that we still use to just talk about economics in general, often even forgetting they started with Marx. So as I said, he was trying to figure out what's going on in society in the early and mid 1800s. It's helpful to remember that Marx is living and thinking at the same time as Charles Dickens, and looking at the same changes that Dickens examines in his famous story, A Christmas Story. The difference between Bob Cratchit being so poor and living in the slums and his employer, Ebenezer Scrooge, being so wealthy. That's exactly the sort of thing that Marx is looking at. Society is diverging like this, as those people at the top are keeping all this new wealth that industrialization created. They're keeping it to themselves. They're not sharing it. And for Marx, he's looking long term. He calls himself a historian. He's saying, the changes that are happening are the results of things that have unfurled over centuries. And we need to understand the underlying dynamics. So he said one of the key things we need to think about is this idea of the production of wealth, the means of production of wealth. That's kind of the first term on the outline in the lecture notes that hopefully you have in front of you. How does society produce its wealth? And who controls it? So means of production means, how do we create the wealth? So in earlier times, in medieval Europe, as we talked about on Wednesday, wealth was created through land. It was an agricultural society, and whoever controlled the land controlled the resources produced upon it. And so the nobles controlling it got the wealth for themselves, and the poor peasants actually doing the work, they got less. They stayed poor. That becomes a fundamental divide in society. So Marx is looking around thinking, well, where is all this new resources coming from? What's the essential means of production, the way we're producing wealth? It's not land anymore. So what is it? Well, if you thought back to what we talked about on Wednesday and said, capital, maybe? You're right. Marx is the one that really points us towards looking at the key role of capital. Control of capital, money, is how industrialists go about creating the wealth, like we said, with the example of Antonio running his textile factories. Capital allows you to hire workers. Capital allows you to purchase raw materials. Capital allows you to build a factory and rent the land for it. Capital allows you to then market your goods and sell them. Capital is the means of production. No capital, no production, no goods, no wealth. Nothing. So, the people who control it, the financial classes, the Ebenezer Scrooges, or the Andy Carnegies, they're the ones in control. Now you also have the workers. They're the ones they're actually in the mills, in the factories, working the machines, creating the goods that are going to be sold. But they don't control capital, and so they've got less weight in this. So that's the key question, Marx says. Who controls the means of production of wealth? Or in modern society, we often just short that to means of production, and the of wealth is understood. Control over the means of production. Now for Marx, society is also always in conflict. Marx is the creator of that conflict perspective that the textbook talks about at the end of each chapter. Because it says society is defined by this struggle over this wealth. We're producing wealth, but who gets it? The people at the top who are controlling the means of production, or the people at the bottom who are actually producing it? Nobles versus peasants in the pre-industrial world. And their conflict, ultimately it's these two groups, and every other group in society ends up choosing sides one way or the other. And eventually that conflict becomes so deeply entrenched, it just pulls the society apart. This is Marx's idea of a dialectic. That's a term I didn't put in the lecture notes, because that's getting us into the politics. But he says, yeah, there's this struggle, and society falls apart. But because everyone was focused on that fight over the means of production, they kind of ignored the fact that there was some other stuff going on. In the medieval world, there were these merchants who were generating capital based in the cities. And they're going to be fundamentally important for whatever comes next, which, capitalism, control of capital, because they're the ones who've got it. And modern capitalist society, Marx says, is going to end up being defined by this struggle between the capitalists, who own everything, and the workers, who are actually producing the goods. Marx is, I said, writing early in this process. He's already seen this conflict form up, which will indeed become the major conflict later in the century and into the 20th century. The fights between, in American terms, labor and management. But it's over this same process. Okay, that's the first key concept. Means of production of wealth. Connected into this is his other key insight. And this goes by the term surplus value. This is actually the third thing on the list in the notes. What happens is Marx is looking around and realizing not only does industrial society create wealth, but it creates a lot more wealth than the old agricultural production did. Society is getting vastly wealthier than it was in earlier times. Remember, that was number one on Wednesday's list of key effects. Creates wealth. I could have said creates lots of wealth. And so Marx is also wondering, well, why? Where is all this wealth coming from? So he starts to think about the whole idea of production. He says, okay, if we look at the raw materials of steel, for example, we've got iron, we've got nickel, we've got manganese, we've got limestone, we need coal for heat. We know how much all of that costs. We know the value of the pile of iron ore. We know the value of the pile of nickel, the manganese, the limestone, the coal. We can add all those up. They do not equal the price of steel. The finished steel is worth more than all the raw materials. There's extra value added by the production. And Marx says that's what he's looking at. What is this what he calls surplus value? The extra value that's been added in. That's the new wealth. We've created new resources, new value. Where does it come from? I mean, that's the obvious next question. Marx ponders that, and he realizes there's something missing from the equation. Yeah, we've got iron, nickel, manganese, limestone. We've got all the raw materials. And he starts thinking, well, what else? But what else could there be? He realizes, yes, there is something missing. Labor. The value of the men coming into the mill, hauling wheelbarrows, stirring up that vast pool of molten metals, working on it, using machines, all of this labor. Well, that's got value too. And that value is being added in to the value of the raw materials to create something more valuable than we started with. There's the wealth. So that's the second concept, surplus value. Industrial production. Taking things from raw materials and combining those materials to make something new. Well, that act of combining them, the work, the labor that's put into that, creates something that's more valuable than we had before. And that adds wealth to society. And because industrial production is so good at producing things with new value, it just adds all kinds of wealth. Now this comes back to that idea of there's a fight in society, because this in the end is what capital and labor are fighting over. Who gets that wealth? And at first, the Ebenezer Scrooges and Andy Carnegies all said, no, it's all ours. We took the risk, we got the capital, we got control, we get the benefits. And then what happened is labor gets together and says, sorry, Andy Carnegie, I didn't see you actually sweating it out in 100-degree heat in that steel mill anytime recently. We're the guys doing that. Without our labor, there's no steel, there's no value for you to hoard in your bank account. So we should get it. Okay, so there's the conflict. There's Marx's analysis. Here's where we can come back to that question of how could Marx not be a Marxist? Because Marx laid all this out and says, yeah, over time, this is the conflict that's going to pull at capitalist society. Society's going to get bigger and bigger, and wealth's going to get hoarded, and over time, and by time he means centuries, we're going to get this same conflict. Just as the conflict between nobles and peasants eventually pulled apart medieval society, this conflict between capital and labor will force everybody else eventually to take sides, and the whole system will collapse, and some new system will come out of it. And that's kind of where Marx, the social scientist, ends. Marx, the politician, then started to make predictions about what that new society should look like. And it should be, he said, it'll be a socialist paradise where there will not be social classes or and labor will dominate and those sorts of slogans. But that's not based on any of his data. That's him kind of thinking, what if? Where are we going? And then political groups In particular the 19th and into the early 20th century, revolutionary groups that really don't like the way society is forming up find in these ideas a justification for their ideas of revolution. We want to push things along. This is where we come to the idea of Marxism. You can think of all that analysis. We often call that Marxian. M-A-R-X-I-A-N. Marx, the social scientist. Now we have revolutionaries and people like the Bolsheviks, like Lenin over in Russia, and other groups saying, all right, we want to get there fast. Let's just push this conflict along and tear the whole thing down. And Marx himself said, you can't hurry it up. This has got to play out over centuries. So, sorry guys, you can't shortcut. That's the point in which Marx says, I'm not a Marxist, because I don't think you can shortcut the process. I don't think you can hurry it up. It's got to play out. This is how history works. This is the analysis. So it's that Marxism, let's shortcut it, let's turn this economic analysis into a political program. That's Marxism. That's what kind of fell apart at the end of the 20th century and has been pretty much discredited. But the social science part, here's how capitalism works. Here's why it generates so much money. Those two ideas. Means of production of wealth, and connected to that, who controls it, and the idea of surplus value. Those are still key to how we think about economics, and particularly industrial capitalism, even today. So that's Marx.